Muted. Good morning. It's a moment of extreme pleasure to welcome our special guest today, Lekha Chakraborty, a renowned economist, professor at NIPFP, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. She's also a research associate of Levy Economic Institute and member of board of International Institute of Public Finance, Munich. She is the author of Fiscal Consolidation, Budget Deficit and Macroeconomy. She is also a leading columnist in the Indian Express, The Hindu, Financial Express, Business Line, and Business Standard. She's also featured in CNBC, ANI, DD News, and Rajya Sabha. Madam area of interest are macroeconomics of public finance, fiscal federalism, extractive sector economics, financing human development, and gender budgeting. Without taking much time, I'll hand over the session to the madam. Madam, you can please take care, ma'am. Thank you so much. We warmly welcome you on behalf of our college and behalf of our students, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Sulojana. It's my privilege and it's my honor to speak to your students and, aspiring IAS students. And, and it's a very productive morning for me because I always look forward to speaking to students. And as you wanted me to speak on the fiscal rules and the fiscal responsibility and budget management in the context of India, and what is the efficacy of the monetary policy and fiscal policy in containing inflation. So I will try to make the concepts and the thought process very simple so that students will be able to understand better. The punches, high fiscal deficit and high debt in our country right now, I do believe that it doesn't have substantial fiscal cost because the articulation is we are focusing on high fiscal deficit to enhance capital infrastructure investment in the economy and also trying to reduce the output gaps. So if this is the narrative, then you don't have to fear deficits. So this is exactly the articulation of Finance Minister Srimati Nirmala Sitharaman when she presented the last budget. But now the inflation is mounting. Then comes the question, is fiscal deficit inflationary? Or this inflation is due to some other elements? Let us unpack that. Inflation is happening because of global uncertainties, supply chain disruptions, and due to war in Ukraine, the trade is affected, the consignments are getting delayed. So it's an exogenous supply side shock and the energy price volatility. So these are concerns and these are causing inflationary pressures in the economy. Now, what is the mandate of the central bank in our country? The prime mandate of the central bank, RBI, in India is price stability. So if price stability is a primary mandate of RBI, why RBI was hesitant to increase the interest rates, the policy rates, to confront this mounting inflation and to tame it? There comes the narrative that in the time of pandemic, in the time of economic crisis, growth first, that was, the predominant narrative of the central bank. So we expected that central bank will try and increase the interest rates, increase the policy rates to tame inflation, but growth first was that narrative, by the central bank. But this, articulation of this communication by the central bank is little changed right now. If you look at April 8th, the recent April Monetary Policy Committee minutes, the recommendations, in that press meeting, RBI Governor Dr. Shaktikant Das has clearly mentioned, we have changed our stance. Now it is not growth first. We are giving importance to inflation prior to growth. So that acceptance of the reality that this inflation is not transient, and that acceptance of reality is welcome. So what exactly happened in RBI? They have not increased the policy rates to tame inflation. If you look at the policy rates, repo rate, that's the rate in which RBI, lends to commercial banks. So that repo rate is kept constant at 4%. And since May 2020, the repo rate in India is kept at 4%. Now, what is a reverse repo rate? Reverse repo rate is a rate in which the commercial banks can park their liquidity or assets back to the RBI. And that is kept at 3.35 since May 2020. Now, how they maneuver the policy rates and how the RBI has gone hawkish, not touching the reverse repo rate and the repo rate in India, because they have not changed these rates. What they have done is they have introduced a new tool called standing deposit facility. So what exactly is this standing deposit facility? So here, it's not a post-pandemic innovation or anything, this SDF. At the cutoff yield rate of 3.99 at the variable reverse repo rate, RBI has already started the process of normalization of absorbing, excess liquidity into the system. So that was very informal kind of normalization. Now, in the MPC announcement, this new policy kit is announced. That is the SDF, the standing deposit facility, in which, the commercial banks can park their liquidity with the central bank at 3.5 instead of the fixed repo rate at 3.35. So that's the difference that has happened, and 3.75. So this 3.75 standing deposit facility is quite an attractive thing to absorb the excess liquidity in the system. So that's a way the RBI has managed, to absorb. So we have to wait and see whether this is successful or not. This was just announced in the April 2022, MPC meetings. But if RBI bites the bullet and increase the interest rate to tame the inflation, what will happen? Reverse repo rate, that is exactly which is at 3.35, because they kept it lower that time to nudge the commercial banks to involve in credit deployment. So that's why it was kept at 3.35. And now there is a rethinking that the monetary policy corridor, that corridor needs to be narrowed, because it's very widened. Because what exactly is the corridor? The marginal standing facility, that's the rate in which RBI, the commercial banks can do overnight, lending process, that is now 4.25. So it's quite huge, that corridor. We need to narrow down that corridor. That's the way RBI has maneuvered this time, by adjusting the corridor from the accommodative phase. But the articulation is not towards a neutral phase, but the withdrawal of, excess liquidity into the system. So that's a way they have announced that it's just a withdrawal, but not exactly, neutral stance. It's a withdrawal from the accommodative stance. That's all, was articulated by RBI governor. And to get the things in perspective, I'll tell you that in India, February 2016 onwards, we have a new monetary policy framework. And as per that new monetary policy framework, inflation containment is the only mandate of RBI. They have to look into only the inflation containment. That means, they don't have to look into the economic growth or other kind of, exchange rate management, nothing. Because that's a change of, policy stance that has happened with regard to the monetary policy reaction function. So when the price stability is the sole criteria of RBI, why RBI was hesitant and fallen behind the inflation curve, so far, and gave importance to growth first? That's exactly because, these are extraordinary times, and extraordinary times, that require extraordinary policy responses. So RBI needs to be, giving importance to the growth priorities. That's why, since May 2020, 2020, growth first was the predominant, objective of RBI, because we were, passing through a pandemic period. Right now, that policy stance can be little dangerous because of external pressures as well. And if you look at the global uncertainties, it's not only from the war in Ukraine. What US Fed Reserve is doing, that's also important to look into, because US Fed Reserve Chair Jay Powell, he has indicated in the Jackson Hole meeting early this year that Fed Reserve will be reducing the balance sheet of the their central bank, and they will be involved with the series of interest rate hikes, and they will try to absorb the liquidity from the system. So it's kind of a taper tantrum, because they will do the tapering process. And why this is a taper tantrum? Because tapering process, of course, it's inevitable that their interest rates will go up when they do the tapering process, and that's exactly is happening. A series of interest rate hikes will happen from the US. So how it affect the other emerging economies? It can affect the emerging economies, especially the fragile economies like Brazil, India, Turkey. A component of the foreign capital investment we have is in portfolio investment. That's a hot money. And hot money, by definition, it responds to interest rate differentials. Where interest rate is high, the hot money will fly to that country. So if the US is increasing the interest rate, and in order to avoid the capital flight, Central Bank of India has to increase the interest rates, because otherwise we have to confront the capital flight, because it's hot money, and hot money will respond to interest rate differentials. So this is one challenge. Second is, look at the financialization of savings. Why people are moving away from the term deposits and the savings in the bank to equity markets, and they are trying to take high risk, high return assets. Why that's happening? And, there is a kind of uneven access and uneven behavior, fiscal and monetary behavior over there, because, people belong to the middle income class. They will not, take that risk, and they put their hard-earned money into high-risk, high-return assets, or they don't even try the equity market. So financialization of savings is getting affected. The moment you keep, your interest rates lower. Why? Because India is experiencing negative real rate of interest. And in the press conference after the MPC meetings, Dr. Shaktikant Das clearly communicated that he will look into this matter with priority, that the zero-bound interest rates and negative rate of interest are matters of concern, and he will look into this. And what exactly is real rate of interest? Nominal rate of interest minus inflation. And inflation is mounting. It's now, MPC, they projected that projections have come, and it's touching 5.7. But if you look at, 3 consecutive quarters, inflation is crossing 6%, but the comfort zone in India for inflation is 6% by mandate. What exactly is a mandate? As I mentioned earlier, by the new monetary policy framework, in India, we practice inflation targeting. And what exactly is inflation targeting? You peg your policy rates as per a nominal anchor of inflation. That nominal anchor, by mandate, we decided that that's 4% in India, inflation. And then plus or minus 2, that's a band we kept, because 4%, maintaining a 4% inflation is very tough, so that you can go up to 6%. That is the official, that comfort zone that I talked about. But if, inflation crosses 6%, that's a comfort zone, consecutively 3 quarters, then RBI needs to be, articulating why it has happened like that. And by mandate, we have to look into the efficacy of, inflation targeting. So there is a fundamental rethinking that has to happen. and it is happening also across world about the inflation targeting framework. So this inflation targeting, that is pegging your policy rates, interest rates based on inflation anchor, inflationary expectations, its deviation from inflationary expectations and output gap. Whether that's a plausible way to go about in containing inflation. So that efficacy of inflation targeting is getting increasingly questioned because countries are not able to maintain the inflation within their prime mandate of whatever nominal anchor they have decided. So in US, by mandate, they have changed the nominal anchor. In India, after 5 years, because this was introduced in February 2016 as per the Ujit Patel Committee recommendations, we have gone ahead with an agreement between Government of India and RBI to get into this inflation targeting framework. And as for that, I mentioned based on inflation anchor, its deviation from inflationary expectations and output gap, we peg the interest rate. And what exactly is output gap? That's a difference between your potential output and actual output. And potential output and actual output is calculated on the basis of GDP in our country. But in NATO economies, they look into US economy, they look into employment. When they talk about their potential output, that's in terms of employment. But RBI has not integrated employment as a policy objective in their monetary policy reaction function. We focus on potential GDP. And, potential GDP or this output gap, it's very controversial in the sense the method in which you come to the potential output, that is very controversial. You use econometric filters, and the filters have a lot of limitations as an econometric methodology. You use that filters because endpoint problem, a lot of things happen if you use the HP filter. You can leave the technicalities, but basic assumption is in a series, you have cyclical elements and the trend component. So what exactly this output gap does, or the potential output is, you take out that cyclical elements in that series and call the trend as the potential. So here comes the question that trend, can it be called the potential? Because potential has to be an envelope concept. So there are controversies. And also this controversy is happening because of the analytical framework of economic growth that's used in the context of an emerging economy like India. In the sense, business cycles, we date the business cycles, the ups and downs. So that's a way, we perceive economic growth process. But if this business cycles, that framework is not quite all right, and if there are issues with the distinct cycles in the economy, especially in the context of pandemic, then our basic analytical framework itself is wrong to make the policy imperatives. In the sense, if there are no distinct cycles operating in an emerging economy context, then using fiscal policy and monetary policy as countercyclical policy tools to tackle inflation and other macroeconomic crises, that's not going to be perfect. You can take a look into that paper by Mark and Geeta Gopinath. That paper is titled Cycle is Trend. The very simple articulation of that is, if you don't have cycles, then the drop in GDP may not be a transient drop. That drop in GDP can be a permanent scar. If that drop in GDP is a permanent scar, then using fiscal and monetary policy to take back that GDP to the prior pandemic levels or the prior economic crisis convergence, that's not going to happen. Because, excuse me, excuse me. Excuse me. Why that doesn't happen? Because, they click, and there are structural elements in the, and there are structural elements in the growth process. So you assume that we focus on monetary policy and fiscal policy just as counter-cyclical policy tools to correct the growth process. What we miss is a structural bottlenecks or structural, structural, excuse me. Yes. When we talk about the economic stimulus packages in the context of India, why the government of India and the subnational governments focused on two components. One is that instantaneous firefighting package component to address the cyclicality issue. The other is using this crisis as an opportunity. There are a lot of structural reforms that's happening in the Indian economy at the center level and at the state levels. That's very important. Otherwise, if you just focus on the fiscal policy and monetary policy just as counter-cyclical policy tools, things are not going to work because there's a drop in GDP, that may be permanent scar. So that a counter-cyclical policy activities will, automatically take the economy back to that V shape or U shape. That assumption can be quite wrong. Also, we need to acknowledge that this V-shaped recovery is happening for whom? There is an uneven recovery in the Indian economy. And credit deployment by the central bank, that was the predominant narrative to tackle the growth recovery process. And if the predominant narrative of the government and the central bank is the credit deployment, of course, the economic growth will turn to be uneven. Why? Because access to credit, that was uneven. If you look into the credit deployment statistics, the access to credit was uneven. Who accessed the credit? We need to look into. But if you look into YOY, year-on-year growth rate, you may see that there's some kind of growth in the case of small and medium-term enterprises. But if you look into the composition, out of the total deployment, what is the percentage of the credit accessed by the small and medium term? That may be around 1% or 4%, but who access the credit? Is it the large firms? So these are the questions, students can take a look into, because this empirical evidence is very important to understand that credit deployment, if that is a prime narrative of economic stimulus packages, and that can be very limited in its outcome. And students can take a look into the work by Joseph Stiglitz and Reshe. That paper is titled, which economic stimulus works. And in that article, they have clearly mentioned the credit deployment or the credit-related economic stimulus packages has limited they have limited multiplier effects. So that's a story about the liquidity infusion. Excuse me. But RBI has done whatever it takes to, to deal with the pandemic. And there was a heavy lifting from the part of central government, central bank as well. And the predominant way they did the liquidity infusion was, of course, open market operations, but now they're curtailing it by, absorbing the excess liquidity. But the operation twist, that was another methodology by the RBI to do this credit infusion. And that's, it's a kind of methodology in which you simultaneously sell short-term and simultaneously buy long-term bonds. So what exactly is happening here? You are trying to elongate the maturity structure of your bond market. In that way, you get time for refinancing, because the refinancing risk is postponed. You get space for liquidity infusion. So that is operation twist. So this was one methodology by RBI to do the credit infusion. So there were different methodologies, different toolkits. One was Operation Twist, other is like open market operations, which now they're trying to curtail or minimize. Then they engaged into the targeted repo rate operations. That is like giving importance to the stress sectors and the lending process, which is focused on the stressed sectors. So there are a lot of initiatives by the RBI, but right now, the growth to inflation. Why in that sequence inflation is given importance? Because inflation is CPI inflation crossed more than 13-14%, and CPI inflation is touching 6, and it's crossing little above 6%, which is the comfort zone in India. And this divergence between WPI and CPI itself is a matter of concern, because WPI is quite crucial for the business firms. And now, if you don't address the concerns related to the inflation containment, and if it is just getting into the price, wage spiral and all, then it will be tough to control inflation in future. And this is the right time to focus on the narrative that inflation first, growth later, because inflation containment is also a prerequisite of growth. That's exactly what Dr. Subbarao's argument. And another thing, Dr. Y.V. Reddy, who was a former governor of RBI, he was quite skeptical when India moved towards inflation targeting framework, because when he was governor of India, inflation containment was one of many objectives of RBI. So that monetary policy reaction function was, very comprehensive. So when India moved ahead with inflation targeting framework, there are many questions asked by the economists. One crucial question was, can RBI, anchor the supply side shocks or the supply side related inflation components? Because in India, inflation is not exactly a monetary phenomenon. There are supply side shocks, fuel, food. So how RBI, through the inflation targeting, control these supply side or the exogenous shocks? So the way RBI defend their inflation targeting framework is like this. They mentioned that inflationary expectations channel can tackle this. So through inflationary expectations channel, RBI can control even the exogenous supply side shocks. And the prime objective of RBI is to look into the inflationary expectations and to maneuver that expectations. So that's a way. But, there's debate whether we kept the inflation under 6% over a few years' time. Of course, in the time of pandemic, it crossed 3 consecutive quarters and all above 6%. But over the years, after the new monetary policy framework, the inflation containment in India was due to this successful, anchoring of inflationary expectations, because inflationary expectations is an unobserved variable. So RBI has floated inflation expectation survey since 2011 to tackle this unobserved variable. And of course, potential output is also unobserved variable. And the way we tackle this, as I mentioned, getting into this econometric methodologies and all. So when inflationary expectations is unobserved variable, what exactly has been done by RBI? They got into this expectation survey and that controlling or stabilizing expectations is a prime mandate of that inflation targeting framework. So that's a way they articulate that even the supply chain, supply side shocks and all, they can maneuver through this expectations channel. But, it's an empirical question, and we need to ask whether that was a case in which the inflation is contained in India. That's a question we need to ask empirically, and, the opinion is inconclusive. So that means the basic efficacy of inflation targeting itself is in question, but it is not that we have to, go away from the inflation targeting framework, but there are many questions to be asked whether the repo rate adjustments just by altering the repo rates, can inflation be contained, or we need to look into some other toolkits? So these are the questions we need to ask in the context of India. So that's a story about the central bank and the fiscal monetary policy coordination. Now let's get into pure fiscal. How can the fiscal rules and the fiscal policy can look into this issue? Because we understood that, excuse me, we understood that monetary policy has got limitations in addressing these concerns. Now, fiscal rule is keeping fiscal deficit to GDP at 3%. And also your revenue deficit needs to be phased out. That's a golden rule. What exactly is a golden rule? Revenue receipts and revenue expenditure needs to be equal. Meaning, what you borrow, that will entirely go for the capital spending. You don't borrow for the recurrent expenditure, components. That's a golden rule. But in the time of pandemic, in the time of recession, this can be quite controversial because, revenue spending is quite relevant in the context of pandemic. And you cannot, curtail revenue expenditure, under the assumption that revenue expenditure is bad in the time of pandemic. So golden rule needs to be, kept in shelf in the time of pandemic. And of course, fiscal deficit to GDP at 3%, that threshold ratio, that also need to be relooked into in the time of crisis and pandemic. And that exactly has happened in the context of India at the center government and at the levels of state governments. So now we don't have that strict norm or the threshold fiscal rule that the fiscal deficit to GDP needs to be kept at 3%, because then if the taxes are not buoyant in the time of revenue uncertainty, we need to deal with expenditure compression to reach this fiscal consolidation process. But that can be very costly in the time of pandemic and in the time of economic crisis, times of macroeconomic uncertainties. So we need to give little flexibility to the fiscal threshold norms, that it is not 3% of GDP. Look at the numbers. In the last budget, at the union government level, fiscal deficit to GDP rose to 9.2%. And that's not exactly due to the new expenditure priorities of the center government. It happened due to the revenue uncertainties. The revenues were not buoyant. And it happened due to, of course, there were new expenditure initiatives, and also due to the budget transparency. What exactly is budget transparency? Fiscal deficit, by definition, does not include, the components of borrowing that happens through the, public sector entities or corporate bodies. So that off-budget borrowings, that's kept as an annexure in the union government budget. So that is little non-transparent, that off-budget borrowings or off-budget liabilities. So last year, union government has tackled this budget transparency issue by incorporating a part of that off-budget borrowings into the fiscal deficit. That Food Corporation of India's, borrowing program, that cleansing process happened. That's why, it is 9.2, but it's not due to new expenditure, design or new expenditure priorities in the time of pandemic. It's when you decompose, you understand that it happened due to new expenditure priorities, revenue shortfall, and due to this budget transparency exercise. So these, you have to decompose and see, because that decomposition exercise is very crucial. You may have high public debt to GDP ratio, and you need to understand what are the different determinants towards that. And low GDP, that's a denominator, right? That could be one reason. Then your past liabilities, the interest payments, could be another reason. And, the rate of interest Of course, that is exogenous to government of India, but high rate of interest could be another reason for high, debt legacy. So there are different components to the high debt, and we need to decompose and understand the contributions of each of these determinants into the high debt, variable. And there's a beautiful study by Chetan Khat. He was the MPC member, Monetary Policy Committee member, last Monetary Policy Committee member. Then it changed. First Monetary Policy Committee, he was member. And his author is Piali. Take a look into that paper, how they decomposed the public debt GDP and tried to understand what are the components behind this high public debt to GDP in the country. They have looked into the rate of interest payments, the denominator, GDP. So they looked into various, components, and they tried to understand the exact magnitude of each of these factors contributing to high debt to GDP. But in many countries, the public debt GDP is above 100%. So the threshold norm needs to be relooked into because, the debt can be unsustainable only if the rate of interest, a real rate of interest, is greater than the real growth of economy. That is R greater than G. So then only, your debt will go unsustainable. But if the R is not greater than G, then, the threshold ratio of debt may cross 90. That's exactly has happened in the context of India. But don't fear that. That's articulation by Finance Minister, because we cannot contain public debt at this moment because, that will affect the growth recovery process. And what's a basic argument against high fiscal deficit or high public debt? You argue that creates intergenerational inequities. Because the future generations you're putting to debt hangover. No, because, if you are using the high public debt or high deficit, for enhancing the capital infrastructure, for enhancing the human capital formation in the economy, and to reduce the output gaps, then that's intergenerational equity. It's not inequity, because you're doing things right now, for education, for health. You need money for creating the social infrastructure. Your debt may mount, but the social infrastructure that have intergenerational equity. So you need to spend correct this moment. So that's a way you can articulate high debt. But if the high debt is not used to grow, and if it is used for the fiscal profligacy and freebies and populist measures, then the story is going to be entirely different. So that should not happen. But you can use the public debt for productive purposes, then it's welcome. But not, of course, not for fiscal profligacy or freebies or populist measures to incentivize the calculus of consent of people, because people are myopic. In retrospect, if the government did well, satisfying their incentives, then people, their calculus of voting behavior or the calculus of consent, the consent they have to give to vote back the government back to power. So government may try to incentivize that calculus of consent, but those populist measures can be a little dangerous given the limited space we have. Otherwise, if you're using the high debt for the correct investment purposes, then it can be of long term. I have written a book about the fiscal consolidation, budget deficit, and macroeconomy. It's published by Sage. Students can take a look into the chapters. And in each of the chapters, I try to articulate that a timely fiscal deficit is good for Indian economy. So that's a way I looked into from the high frequency data analysis and a long-term time series analysis. I tried to look into the impact of deficit on the other macroeconomic variables like inflation, interest, money supply, so different macroeconomic parameters, even the crowding out question. So the empirical evidence, that's coming out from my analysis is a timely fiscal deficit is good, and the deficit is not the villain behind the interest rate hike or crowding out. That exactly was the articulation of Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharamanji this year. She refuted the neoclassical argument that high, fiscal deficit crowds out private investment. No, she articulated that we have high fiscal deficit, but we don't fear that high fiscal deficit. We are using it for enhancing public investment, and this public investment crowds in private corporate investment. So that was her narrative, and there is no crowding out, but crowding in the context of emerging economies. And there's another paper by me, Rishikesh Vinod. He's a famous econometrician and my former colleague now in IMF, Honey, Karan. And Karan, Vinod and myself, we have written that paper, and it is published in the Handbook of Statistics, that's edited by C.R. Rao, the famous econometrician, and Rishikesh Vinod. Students can take a look into that work. We used an econometric methodology called maximum entropy ensembles bootstrapping methodology. What exactly is that? When your time series is limited, then you cannot, do meaningful models or meaningful, econometric models. Why? Because a short time series, what exactly that coefficient trying to tell you when your, time series is very short? So how to tackle these kind of issues? So maximum entropy ensembles method is, if your observation is just 40 in number, that create ensembles. It's like a creation of reincarnations, of that 40 observations into 999, and the beta, the coefficient which looks into the link between the public and private, for instance, public and private investment. That new coefficient is from that ensembles of 999 observation instead of that short time series. And your new beta, you need to look into whether it is significant or not within the confidence interval. So that's quite helpful. And another econometric methodological limitation is when the variables are integrated of different order, because when you do the stationarity test, when that's integrated of different order, like I0 integrated of 0, I0 and I1, then, economists, have issues. How we go ahead with running the models if our variables are not integrated of same order? Students can just write down, and you will learn all these techniques as a part of econometric methodology. And the students from non-economics background, they can just forget about these technical details I mentioned. But all what I have to highlight is from the perspective of public investment, how crucial that is for inviting the private investment. From that perspective, these robust models prove that public investment is a prime determinant of private corporate investment. So that exactly is a message I want to give to the students. So that's exactly what is, what we are trying right now. We focus on public investment, and we expect that there is no direct crowding out, or there is no financial crowding out. What is direct crowding out? It's $1 to $. Like if you increase $1 in public investment, that leads to $1, crowding in of private corporate investment, not crowding out as the neoclassicals believed. Because in the context of emerging economies, we need to understand that infrastructure investment crowds in private corporate investment. And what exactly is financial crowding out? That's a dichotomy. We need to understand that the financial crowding out happens through rate of interest mechanism. That is, in the loanable funds market, of course, these funds are limited, and we preempt that funds to finance the deficits. Then what is available for the private corporate sector may be limited. So then it can lead to a rise in the interest rates. And that's a way, the crowding out can happen. So this is a way neoclassicals argue. But the financial crowding out happens or not, that question needs to be looked into the perspective of whether deficit leads to rise in interest rates or not. What exactly determines interest rate in the context of India? whether it is inflationary expectations, whether it is the interest rate differentials, you need to look into the global uncertainties, the variables, the macroeconomic variables that is external as well. So you need to have a comprehensive model and try to understand, control for all these variables, try to understand whether the deficit is behind, the shooting up of interest rates, if the deficit is villain. So these empirical questions need to be answered before you conclude that there is going to be crowding out. So that exactly is what was argued by, our finance minister when she talked about the public investment, when she talked about the public investment going to crowd in private corporate investment. So we have to wait and see, how this cycle is going to get implemented and operated, because fiscal space is crucial. And we have to be very careful regarding the fiscal space, not to use it for any fiscal profligacy. That's very crucial. But at the same time, the quality of fiscal consolidation can suffer if we focus on expenditure compression than the tax buoyancy. If the taxes are not buoyant, then how you reach that fiscal consolidation of the 3%? Because right now, India believes in 4.5% of GDP, the fiscal deficit. And what was the articulation? The excess deficit procedure, that is medium term. By 25-26, we need to take the fiscal deficit back to 4.5%. Okay, that's the medium term. So investors' confidence has not suffered because the communication from the finance minister was perfect. That it is due to enhancement in the capex, that the high deficit, or the mounting debt in the country. But if you grow out of debt, there is no harm in it. That's exactly what I mentioned technically about R and G. R is the real rate of interest. That's a cost of credit. G is the growth of economy. So if R is less than G means, G is greater means you are growing out of debt. Your cost of credit is below the growth of economy, right? So that's okay. So if R is greater than G, then things are different. Then debt is unsustainable. Then you have to think about an eventual monetization of deficit. And what is monetization of deficit? You have to do a fiscal monetary policy coordination with the central bank so that there will be seigniorage financing of deficit. What exactly is seigniorage? Technically, it is a change in high-powered money to GDP. High-powered money, it's also known as reserve money. So in the Handbook of Indian Economy, that statistics published by RBI, students can take a look into that reserve money component. So there are different components to reserve money. One particular component is net RBI credit to the government. Another component is foreign exchange reserve. So if you look into that reserve money, its components, over the years, we have controlled the net RBI credit to the government. That is the monetization of deficit. So that was an institutional reform because monetized deficit was creating inflationary pressures in the economy. So to tackle that, over the years, that time, when Dr. C. Rangarajan was the governor of RBI that time, we entered into an agreement. The government of India and RBI entered into an agreement that we are going to control the monetized deficit. And there was a shift in the financing of fiscal deficit from the seigniorage financing to the bond financing. And each mode of financing the deficit has got its own consequences, macroeconomic consequences, in the sense, if you go ahead with too much of seigniorage financing, of course, inflationary pressures can happen. And too much of bond financing beyond the point of R and G, if you look into that, when R crosses G, then the debt becomes unsustainable and you cannot go on and on with the bond financing of deficit. Then you have to eventually monetize your deficit. That's why your monetary arithmetic can be little unpleasant. That is unpleasant monetary arithmetic. Sargent and Wallace spoke about that. Like if R is greater than G, then bond financing is no longer plausible. Then you need to eventually switch to the synergy financing of deficit. And if that happens, inflation today or inflation tomorrow is the only policy flexibility you have. So you are eventually monetizing your deficit, then inflation will happen. So that's the way they have articulated that inflation today or inflation tomorrow is the only policy thing you can do when you talk about the financing of fiscal deficit. You need to understand this reality. And what are the different modes of financing the fiscal deficit? As I mentioned, you can finance your deficit through seigniorage. You can finance your deficit through the bond financing, and also you can engage in the external financing of deficit. And external financing of deficit can be a little tricky because that leads to balance of payment crisis, a lot of conditionalities, because we don't have a lot of donor presence in the context of India. And that's very crucial when we look into the financing of deficit, because the external financing of deficit is negligible. And in the context of external uncertainties, global uncertainties, that's giving a lot of cushion to the context of India, because our external financing of deficit is negligent, very insignificant. Our predominant way of financing deficit is bond financing of deficit. So theoretically, neoclassicals argue that bond financing of deficit can lead to crowding out and all. But you need to empirically ask that question whether that happens in the context of Indian economy or not. So these are very important empirical questions. Now, many economists ask about opening this monetization of deficit once again in the context of India. Are we willing to do that? Because right now, many economists believe that it was very good that we have not looked into monetization of deficit in the context of India, because there is no fiscal profligacy or inflationary pressures that's happening from monetization of deficit. But we need to ask a question: the recovery that has happened in India, that is, that process, whether that can be justified, because uneven recovery, it's a matter of concern. So what Indian government has done for the poor households, Indian households, and the poor business firms, what we have done for the people belong to the low rung of pyramid when we talk about economic recovery. So, economists, I do remember that, an economist argued that, of course, we have intentions to do that, but how long we can cross-subsidize? Only a part of Indian population, maybe less than 4% or like that, because only 8% is in organized sector, only 4% pay tax. So with that tax, how can you cross-subsidize and, tackle these issues? But that is a little sad, that argument, because one, you need to look into the structure of taxation, and indirect taxes, that component to the tax structure is also significant. It's huge. It's not only direct tax, the taxation that's coming from the corporate taxes or direct taxes through income tax. Poor people do pay tax. Indirect taxes can be little regressive also, like the burden, the tax incidence, if we look at, that burden is on poor people. So poor people do pay tax. So that argument of cross-subsidization, that's very sad, that argument. That should not be the case. Here the assumption is tax stability or revenue stability is the core determinant of expenditure design or expenditure priorities. If that is the case, when your revenues are unstable, you have to curtail spending, even if the government has an intention to help poor. As you don't have the fiscal space, you need to curtail such programs, because you're asking basically the question, where is money? That is very sad, because, in the time of pandemic, we cannot ask the question, where is the fiscal space? We need to enhance the fiscal space. And what are the avenues to increase the fiscal space? Of course, on tax revenue, that's not going to happen because revenues are uncertain. And we are trying the level best to enhance fiscal space through the taxation. And we tried non-taxation as well, the capital receipts. We tried privatization. Instead of implementing or introducing a COVID tax or increasing the tax rates, that will further affect the disposable income in the hands of people. So Government of India has not done any tax-related, COVID tax-related policies, because stability and predictability is what government has given importance. And what government tried to enhance the fiscal space is through enhancing the privatization proceeds or disinvestment proceeds. But that also didn't work well. In the context of pandemic and in the context of global uncertainties, the fiscal marksmanship suffered most in that component of fiscal disinvestment proceeds. What is fiscal marksmanship? That looks into the budget credibility, what you project, what you forecast, and what you realize. There should not be huge deviation between your aspiration and reality. So your fiscal marksmanship is perfect only when there is no significant deviation in the fiscal forecast. There should not be any fiscal forecasting errors. But disinvestment proceeds, our aspirations was quite huge. But if you look into the numbers, the real actual proceeds, that deviation is quite huge. So this year, Government of India was quite realistic in assuming the fiscal proceeds that's coming from the disinvestment proceeds. But then when the fiscal space is constrained, when you have the responsibility to help the people who are, bearing the brunt of the pandemic, then you need to think about how we can enhance the fiscal space. There, the financing mode of deficit, that needs a relook. And even the seigniorage, the limited, finite money financing a fiscal program was argued, that as a very important mode of financing in the time of pandemic by Professor Kaushik Basu, the former chief economic advisor of our country, and the Nobel laureate Abhijit Banerjee. So they have spoken about, the monetization of deficit. The context is very important, because if you're reaching to a point where you don't have any fiscal space and the avenues to enhance the fiscal space is limited, please don't do expenditure compression, but think about a money financing a fiscal deficit. But that's not exactly the helicopter dropping of money into the hands of people in the form of cash transfers or anything. No, not that fiscal profligacy or anything, but targeted cash transfers as a judicious mix if required, and government acting as an employer of last resort. That's very crucial to help the people in the pandemic. And also to look into the financing of human development components in the economic stimulus package program, like looking into social security measures and social infrastructure, because there is digital divide that's happening in the education sector, which is affecting the enrollment, which is affecting this huge learning loss, which we need to look into. We need to look into health sector. The health sector to GDP, that spending is below 1% in the context of union government. We need to use this crisis as an opportunity to relook into the public infrastructure in the health sector that is very crucial. And God forbid that next peak pandemic, that peak should not happen in June, as a few epidemiologists predicted, but it should not happen. But the preparedness of the health sector is quite relevant. Then deficit versus investment in health, you should be giving emphasis to investment in the health sector. Then social security, as I mentioned. Then food security, that's very crucial. You cannot do a normalization process of what you have announced from the fiscal policy stance in the time of pandemic. So the fiscal policy needs to be accommodative in the time of pandemic. And there, there should be a fundamental rethinking in the efficacy of fiscal rules. That's very crucial. And that should be the motto of the government, that you need to keep the fiscal policy accommodative in the time of pandemic. And that's clearly the articulation by IMF. Geeta Gopinath, I was listening to her articulation. So, she mentioned that the fiscal policy has been accommodative and it needs to be accommodative for a few quarters or few years till we come out of this crisis, because survival first, and then we look into the deficit numbers. Otherwise, your deficit numbers may look good, but the cost may be huge. You will get into a prolonged cycle, vicious circle of a kind of uneven recovery in the economic growth process. And I stop here and thank you so much, and wish you all the best for the students who will be appearing for the civil service exams, and let your aspirations and prayers meet, and you come out with flying colors. All the best. God bless you, students. Thank you so much. Over to you, Professor Sulochana. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to speak to your students.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Ma'am, aspirants posted few questions. If time permits, shall we address 2 or 3 questions right now, ma'am?
Definitely. We can look into the questions.
Yes, ma'am. Shall I ask the questions, ma'am?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Is there a logic behind 3% logic of FRBM?
Oh, okay. That's not a magic number. Maastricht Treaty, when European Union decided on the Maastricht Treaty, that 3% was decided. But that's not exactly the articulation when we think about in the Indian context about that 3%. It's internal based on the savings calculation. But of course, if you ask me the efficacy of that 3%, I think we should not be giving too much importance to that 3% because it's dynamic. The context is dynamic. That's why now the articulation of Finance Minister about her excessive deficit procedure and her roadmap towards fiscal consolidation is not 3%, but 4.5% of GDP by 2025-26. So that's dynamic. That's quite dynamic, and that's welcome, because maybe that budget transparency also needs to be looked into. That's why she's keeping at that 4.5%. So this 3%, it's not a magic number. It's dynamic, and there should be a fundamental rethinking about that threshold ratio, because that time, based on savings calculation, we decided on 3%. Maastricht Treaty, of course, they come up with that norm, that 3%, because that context of European Union is little different, because Maastricht Treaty and the European Union, that's based on an economic integration principle. Their monetary policy is exogenous and exchange rate policy is exogenous. So the individual countries' fiscal policy is a crucial policy tool they have. But that 3% cap on the fiscal policy, I think that led to a lack of flexibility in operational parameters in the context of many countries, especially you remember the Greece crisis and all. So there should be a fundamental rethinking about these numbers, these fiscal rules. And, I don't know which student asked that question, but I do recommend him to take a look into the works by Oliver Blanchard, in the Peterson Institute of Economics, that he has posted his papers over there. So then also in the American Economic Review, there's a paper by Oliver Blanchard on public debt. And that paper he presented in the American Economic Association conference, a presidential address in 2019, prior to pandemic. But that's a very important paper to understand, your concern. And there he mentioned that if you are fearing a bad equilibrium that's going to happen from the fiscal profligacy, you keep a fiscal rule, but don't use it in the time of economic recession. And he also emphasized on the points R and G I mentioned. If the R is greater than G, then you don't have to fear anything. So there is no, significance per se for this 3%, but it was quite convenient for looking into the budget credibility, for the fiscal transparency, and to calculate the fiscal risk. It was quite convenient when we have a fiscal rule. But if you look at the numbers of the state governments and as well, the costs were huge. The state governments, fiscal deficit was maintained at 3%. But if you take a look into the path in which the fiscal consolidation has happened, that was at the cost of capital spending. Over the years, the state governments have controlled the capital spending. The center government also, the capital spending suffered. So numbers may look good, but the costs were huge. This also reminds me that when I talk about fiscal space, of course, we need to talk about the state governments as well. Now, the articulation is that the state governments can keep their fiscal deficit to GDP up to 4%, not 3% in the time of pandemic. And where is this 4% coming from? Of course, they can go up to 3.5, and the last 0.5 in that enhanced fiscal deficit to GDP ratio, that should be linked to the structural reforms, the power sector reforms, that is performance linked. And the state governments have to look into the power sector reforms to avail that extra borrowing space of 0.5. And, power sector is in doldrums. And if you look at the dashboard statistics, of the power, Ministry of Power, take a look into the financial parameters and operational parameters, the efficiency parameters, the power sector is not doing great. We have, power generation in our country to support, electrification of Indian villages, but the distribution companies of the power sector is in doldrum, and the state government supported them by non-SLR bonds and all. But beyond a point, the mess has not been cleared, and those financial parameters, especially, that gap between aggregate cost and aggregate revenue, that's huge. Then aggregate technical and commercial loss, that's not minimized. Then tariff revisions, that's a political question. Then, a lot of operational parameters and operational efficiency, that's not, done by many state governments. So that's why the fiscal deficit to GDP right now in India at the subnational levels is 4%, where that 0.5 is linked to the structural reforms or the performance-related reforms. And even in the context of the CAPEX, center government has transferred interest-free loans to the state governments in the last budget, like 1 lakh crore and all, to do a front-loading of capital spending, because the heavy lifting of capital spending that's happening at the state levels, of course, not at the center. So to remain flexible, that strict 3%, as you rightly pointed out, that's not a magic number at all. And where is it coming from? That was from an ad hoc calculation of savings that time in the context of India. And if you look at the global articulation of fiscal rules, that Maastricht Treaty was 3%. That's it. But it has to be dynamic. And that's exactly what's happening in the Indian context right now. Thank you. Thank you for that question. Over to you, Launchana. Any more questions?
Yes, ma'am. Aspirants posted few questions. If time permits, we'll address now. It's how
Sure,
we can, ma'am.
sure.
Yes, ma'am. Do bank will park the money under STF rather giving loans to consumer and earn profit with them?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, ma'am. Do bank will park the money under STF rather than giving loans to consumer and earn profit with them?
Oh, that's exactly the issue. We reduced the reverse repo rate to 3.5 since May 2020 to nudge the commercial banks to go ahead with the credit deployment process. But, banks always have the tendency to park back their liquidity with the RBI, at the reverse repo rate. So that tendency was there. Students can take a look into that RBI bulletin and the state of the economy report written by RBI, and also the press release and all posted in the RBI website. So there you can see that, if you look into the reverse repo and the parking of money in the reverse repo with the RBI, that was quite huge. And of course, the central banks, the commercial banks do that because it's 100% safe, liquid, guilt-edged. But right now, with SDF facility, officially we are announcing a normalization procedure in which we need to absorb the excess liquidity and all. But the question remains, as I mentioned, and the concern by that student, whether that credit deployment happened that happened in an uneven manner. We need to look into the statistics. And also, one concern here is, if there is no corresponding growth in the economy, and if there is huge credit infusion, as rightly pointed out by the financial stability report published by RBI recently, it can lead to mounting NPAs, non-performing assets. That's a crucial concern. What will happen if your non-performing assets will mount? And they have done a scenario of stress test, and that's quite alarming. Those numbers, by September 2022, your NPA, the gross non-performing assets may be huge, maybe 9% or something like that. I don't remember that. I think it's around 9. And the concern raised by the financial stability report is the credit deployment beyond a point. If there is no credit growth, that can lead to bad assets. And economists have the tendency to support the credit deployment, referring to the numbers of NPA right now, maybe the high frequency data right now, NPAs may be little less because of the moratorium or what's the forbearance or many policies. NPAs may look good right now, but in the future, that's going to be a problem. And that's exactly what is the stress scenario which was published in the financial stability report. That's in December 2021, I think. The student can take a look into that reports and see the numbers. And that's alarming. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that question.
Yes, ma'am. Shall we take one more questions, ma'am?
Sure, go ahead.
Posted a lot of questions. Maybe we can have one more session, later, or is it possible, if time permits, we'll address now, ma'am, just your convenient time, ma'am.
If it is over 4 or 5 questions, we can take it up.
Yes, ma'am.
I will be here. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Measures to reduce widening WPI and CPI.
Okay, WPI, that is 13.1, or it's about 13% right now. Every month, you need to check that. And the CPI, that's what we consumers experience, and WPI, the business, because that's wholesale, they experience WPI. And the divergence between the WPI and CPI is a matter of concern, because central bank by mandate looks into only CPI. Inflation, so that inflationary expectations and output gap, that inflation targeting model, the nominal angle, all what I mentioned, that's about the CPI. But in the context of energy price volatility, and in the context of food inflation, the efficacy of that CPI, in controlling the inflation, or whether we will be happy if it is controlled within that 6% band, whether we are focusing on the realities related to inflation containment, that itself is a question about the efficacy of the interest inflation targeting and the nominal anchor based on CPI. And the articulation by central government is that we control the CPI because prior to the new monetary policy framework, the CPI was like 11% or something like that. Right now, it's not there. But the crucial question is it because of anchoring the inflationary expectations or any other determinants behind controlling this inflation? So this is an important question to be looked into, and researchers are working on it, whether RBI is able to anchor the inflationary expectations properly. And there are many inflation, core inflation, headline inflation. But the fuel and food inflation, these are very crucial. And the supply side shocks, the only way in which the RBI maneuver the supply side shocks is through the expectations channel. And that's an empirical question. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. So next question, ma'am. Currently, the CPI has breached the 6% upper threshold, but is RBI actually empowered enough to control the food inflation in India, since it is more related to supply side constraint and crude prices?
Absolutely. That's exactly what I mentioned right now. How when inflation is not strictly a monetary phenomenon, how RBI controls these exogenous supply shocks through inflation targeting framework? That's a very brilliant question. And, as I mentioned earlier, through the expectations channel, RBI, the mandate that is to, maneuver or to control the inflationary expectations. So that's a way, they defend. Otherwise, these are matters of concern, like, monsoon shock. That led to inflation in India. So how the monsoon shock is going to get incorporated in the inflation targeting framework? These are questions asked about the supply side shocks. But, July rains, if that fails, inflation happens. But what inflation and targeting has to do with July rains or the monsoon? The only way in which it is articulated is that it is controlled or it gets into the inflationary expectations channel. Through maneuvering the inflationary expectations, we can control that. So that's a way, but it's an empirical question. And your concern is real.
Last question, ma'am. How fiscal policy fails Sri Lanka?
Oh, Sri Lanka is a different story. And we don't have to, worry about what has happened in Sri Lanka. Worry about, in the sense that that's going to happen in India as well. That's what I meant. But of course, what's happening in Sri Lanka is a matter of concern, but it's related to many things, like the way they use the fiscal space and the way they are facing the global uncertainties. It's a small economy, island economy, but those kind of uncertainties will not happen in the context of India because, our macroeconomic fundamentals when compared to Sri Lanka is quite strong. And the way the fiscal policy and monetary policy coordination happens in India, that's quite different from Sri Lanka. So the use of fiscal space, that's quite important. So that's the only lesson what we can, that's the only takeaway when we look into the question of the Sri Lankan economy, in which, as you pointed out about the fiscal policy space, the way they have used. So that's it. If the use of fiscal space is very judicious, then there is a certain element of flexibility in facing the global uncertainties. So that's it.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Your expertise view is going to help the aspirants for both the preparation of prelims and main examinations, ma'am. Thank you so much, and in future we are expecting more such brainstorming sessions from you, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you so much, for giving me the space to speak to the students, and thank you, students, for asking such brilliant questions. And Professor Sulochana mentioned that you will be posting more questions in the YouTube. I will take a look into these questions and I will respond to you in YouTube. Keep posting questions, and thank you so much, and all the best for your exams.
Thank you, ma'am.
And you can also follow me on Twitter. My works, and I can interact you over Twitter as well. You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Yes. Thank you, ma'am.